I'm Assistant Director for Children in Portsmouth, shared across the local authority and the NHS. I also work in the Hampshire ICB system. Um, so I've been asked to come talk to you today about our experience back in September last year of the pilot inspection for the new SEND framework. So we were contacted by Ofsted and CQC so that they could do a dry run, if you like, of the full inspection experience. I think they tested components of the new framework in other places, but they wanted to do the whole 15 days with us. Seemed a good idea at the time. Not sure that I quite thought it was a good idea 10 days in. But what I'll do today is if I rattle through a few slides, I pulled together these slides for a few friends and colleagues up and down the country that were interested in our experience. I'll skip over some bits fairly quickly because it's about the framework itself, and I'll make some assumptions that all of you are fairly familiar with the framework now. There's a few bits in here about managing inspections. I've managed all sorts of inspections, ILACs inspections, yacht inspections over the years. So forgive me if I'm kind of patronising anybody. So just a few hints and tips around managing, particularly a complex inspection like this, because it's whole area rather than single service. But what I'll major on and what I spend most of the time on for the next sort of 25 minutes or so is the kind of key lessons, what we learn, and some hints and tips for you. Okay, let's dive in. So I'll give an overview. The bit I'll also just touch on at the end is the kind of feedback that we gave CQC and Ofsted. That was quite good fun, giving the inspectors feedback. Some of which has made its way into the framework, some of which I'm not quite sure yet. I need to have a chat with some local areas to find out how it's landed in spaces and places. I think there's 3 inspections that have taken place on the full framework. I know of Nottinghamshire. I'm not sure the other 2, but my intention today is just to kind of sort of bring it alive a little bit, rather than just the kind of dryness that's in the actual framework itself. So let's kick off. So in terms of the overview of the pilot inspection, so obviously, as you're aware, it's Ofsted and the CQC, and it's a whole area. 3 weeks, 2 weeks off-site, and the last week is on-site. And as I'm sure you picked up from the framework, it's a real shift from what we experienced in the previous framework. So very much moving away from compliance towards the kind of language you'll hear in an ILACs inspection for safeguarding and looks after children, the experience and outcomes for children with SEND. We've had a JTI inspection. It felt quite similar-ish in terms of the mix between detailed work on individual children versus partnership groups, focus groups, those kind of things. And I'll touch on that in a bit more detail. And as you know, it includes SEN support, and it includes or the commissioning of quality over the commissioning of alternative provision. So the three potential outcomes I'm sure you're familiar with. The bit I've highlighted in red is the bit that was added, I think following our feedback, but I think from feedback from elsewhere to the inspectorates. So at the end of our 3-week jamboree, there was a feeling that we were going to be placed in the kind of middle one. So we didn't get a formal report because it was a pilot, but we were going to be placed in the middle outcome. We kind of challenged that a little bit. So they were particularly concerned in our area around PFA and transition. So preparing for adulthood and transition arrangements. The kind of challenge that we put back a little bit is that we'd absolutely clocked that it was in our self-assessment, and that it was a bit harsh to judge a whole system based on a relatively small whilst important area of SEND work. And on reflection, what the inspectorates kind of came up with is that to get a high level of quality across all the complexity of SEND across a whole area with a wide range of children, huge numbers of children, and a wide range of agencies involved, what was added to that top outcome was if an area had clocked an issue and it was in their strategy and it was in their SEF, then actually it would be unfair to kind of push the local area down a grade. So that language of the local area partnership has taken action where improvements are needed was added, and I think that was really helpful for all of us. The bit at the bottom in terms is in the framework. I'm sure you're familiar with that, and obviously it was a pilot, so it was different for us. But in terms of a real inspection, then that last bullet point, as I'm sure you're familiar with, if you receive the top judgment, then it's a 5-year cycle. If it's the middle judgment, it's a 3-year cycle, and if there's widespread or systemic failings, then it's the 18-month monitoring. I'm sure you're familiar with that process from the framework. So the evaluation criteria, again, I'm sure you'll know it. The reason I kind of list it out for you, just a bit of a kind of hint and a tip for you, is when we had the verbal feedback, they went through in quite some level of detail across all 10 of those. In fact, they missed out one, which was rather curious, but they went through all 10. The depth of information in that hour and a half, 2-hour feedback was really, really rich and really, really good. And that won't necessarily appear in a written report. So a bit of advice for you is to get a very, very good note taker, if not two, in that meeting, because there's some really brilliant stuff, particularly the stuff to celebrate. I think your ears are kind of tuned in inspection feedback to hear the areas of concern. So sometimes you miss on the areas to celebrate, and obviously that's an opportunity to feedback to teams and practitioners on some of the successes in your area. So do take a lot of notes in that feedback session, but the feedback is structured around those 10 evaluation criteria. So we had 8 inspectors, social care, education, and obviously CQC. Not all the inspectors were involved throughout the whole 15 days. In the 10 days off-site, the first 10 days, there's a lot of meetings, a lot of conversations, a lot of stuff around timetabling, for example. I'll come back to that point in a minute. Understanding which inspectors are where and when they're actually working on your inspection as opposed to doing work elsewhere is quite an important thing to do. So to understand that when they're in, when they're out, when they're working on your local area and when they're not is quite key. So a few numbers for you. So we, in order to select the children that they track, so the 6 children that they look at in detail, there has to be a long list. We gave them the full list of children with SEND in Portsmouth. Now we got a piece of software which matches children across various database systems, so education systems, social care systems, and to some extent health, although we're working on that. So we were very open and just said, look, here's all of our children that have got an EHCP, that have got SEN, are on SEN support, and we matched them with social care involvement, so child in need, child protection, looked after child, or care experience, young person, and they selected the 6 out of that very long list. I think different areas will have different ways of approaching this, but essentially what they are seeking to do is to get a representative sample of your young people in those 6 youngsters that they track. I'll come back to language in a minute because the bit around tracking and sampling and focus sampling is interesting. So we'll just kind of nail that a little bit later. So they look in detail at 6 children. I've missed a point. So that there were 5 further child level lists. Now these are taken from the Annex A for the ILACS inspection. So your friends in children's social care will know exactly what that means. So it's the lists of children who are receiving early help support, child in need support, child protection, and looked after children. So they will also want those lists of children that should be very well established or will be very well established in your social care departments. The 6 children that I tracked, and then I counted them all, there were 51 meetings or calls. So this is the timetabling bit. So just like in the old SEND framework, there's a lot of meetings, conversations, traveling into schools, traveling into social care providers and health providers, so that coordination of the timetable and which inspector is where and needs to be given this information before the meeting, all of that inspection management stuff continues to be complex. It's not like that when we manage ILACS inspections these days, which tends to have far less timetabling challenges, but the SEND one still continues to have quite a lot of work to do around the timetabling bit. There's also 3 surveys I'm sure you're aware of parents, the carers, the young people and the practitioners. They've done a lot of work on surveys since we were quite disappointed in the complexity of the surveys, the language in the surveys and the reach. They've done a lot of work on that since to support accessibility for those surveys. So that's really good. I'm really pleased about that. And in the Annex A documentation, there's over 50 documents in those categories that you've seen in the framework. Being the librarian for that is really key and really important. And obviously, you guys are going to have a little bit more time than we did to create those 50 documents and upload them onto the system. So the bit on the 6 children, which is the kind of centerpiece of the inspection. So there's a lot of work to do around the 6 youngsters. So inspectors want to look at the experience of those young people and their journey through the SEND system, and they want to actually talk with the young people themselves and also the professionals that are involved in those children's lives. What we chose to do was to have a pre-meet with the team around that child. I'll say more about that in a minute. Partly to some of the practitioners that are working with those youngsters who've never been in an inspection meeting before. So a part of it was about just settling people down, and part of it was about making sure there's a consistent story across the agencies around that, the youngster, and what we're doing to improve their outcomes. There is a focus on what they would call contemporary practice. There's a little bit of kind of context, so it does go back sort of 6 months on those youngsters. It doesn't go back deep into history, but some of the material that you have to establish for those young people, which I'll touch on in a minute, is there's a lot of it, and it's quite detailed and in depth. I'll come back to that point in a minute. There's then what they call sampling meetings. So there's tracking, there's sampling, and what you've also seen now recently, the introduction of focus sampling, which I'll touch on in a second. So in terms of sampling meetings, so these are where the inspectors from either Ofsted or CQC will go to visit schools, early year settings, health services, early help services. It's specifically to talk about additional children. So this is not to talk about the 6 tracked children. This is an additional group of children. And it may be almost certainly, maybe it will be certainly linked to their initial key lines of inquiry around what they think of your space and place, and what's coming out of your SEP as well. They may also look at case supervision notes. Preparing your colleagues in those services, those schools, those early year settings for that visit is really important, so that they understand it's not an inspection of their provision. Let's be really clear about that. It's to inform the judgment made about the area, and they will specifically want to talk about children and children's notes. So it won't be a kind of strategic conversation around that particular setting, but it will be specifically around a group of children. So they won't name the children when they get there, before they get there, but they will want to kind of look at children's records within that setting and get a sense of the multi-agency work around those children. So we had quite a long discussion around the language. Now, the language has remained, but it took us a little bit of kind of Babel fish work with our partners to explain what a sampling meeting was. It's essentially talking about individual children, as I said. And so what Ofsted and CQC did do, following our feedback, was produce better guidance that goes out to those settings before an inspector knocks on the door wanting to talk about individual youngsters and not about their setting in general. We estimate that around an additional 60 to 80 children were spoken about at some level of detail in those settings. So there's the 6 trapped children, and then there's an additional, we found about 60 to 80, could be more in bigger authority areas than Portsmouth, to talk about those young people's experience and their outcomes. In terms of managing the inspection, so I know later in your agenda you're going to focus quite a lot on the SEF. So getting that right is really important, and we've seen a little bit more information coming out around the SEF, and also the relationship with the annual engagement meeting with Ofsted and CQC. But obviously the SEND strategy and the self-evaluation and ours had huge numbers of documents embedded in as evidence within it. They're the two most significant documents, and having those ready, we had a bit of polishing to do in a quite a short period of time, but having those ready now is obviously really key to having a clear strategic narrative around what your place feels like for children, what your outcomes are, and what you're doing to make further improvements. The LANO role, so the local area nominated officer, it's a heck of a role. I've done it a number of times for a number of inspections. It's full on, full time. All your other inbox emails kind of fill up, and you never get a chance to respond to those because you're very busy on that inspection, and it's a sort of 70-hour a week kind of jobby, this one. Having a LANO that really understands SEND in your local partnership is really important. It's not just an administrative role, it really is important in terms of being able to make that relationship with the lead inspector, be really clear what it is that the inspection team are after, what they need, and being able to kind of have those conversations without always referring the inspectors to somebody else within the system. One of the things that we did, which was I'm really glad we did it, was that we had a senior health lead from our community provider kind of embedded within our team, within the local authority offices. So we managed the inspection from the local authority, obviously, but we had a senior health lead who was their SEND specialist. Even though they work across Portsmouth, Southampton, and the Isle of Wight, we borrowed them fully for those 3 weeks, which we were eternally grateful for. And it really helped in terms of the inspection management and closing down key lines of inquiry really quickly, and all of those kind of things. So I highly recommend that you do that. So it was from the provider, not from the ICB, interestingly, and I think that was probably more important. Now your provider landscape may be a bit more complex than ours, but we got a single community provider for the city. That was really helpful. We did a lot of briefing to staff and partners on the process and the expectations as we understood it. So usual kind of inspection management stuff. And we gave daily updates to the whole network, particularly on the key lines of inquiry. I'll come back to the Chloe's in a minute, just so that we made sure that everybody was up to speed with what inspectors were wanting to learn more about. Also, what they were already saying to us throughout the inspection looked like good and effective practice, because we want to keep everybody's mojo up. Lots of daily internal communications, some guidance from meeting inspectors, and what we call in Portsmouth our time to shine. So those things we're really proud of, those things we think are really good in our SEND system, and making sure that in those 50 meetings that I referred to earlier, that people are telling the same story about what we think is good in the city, and that we can celebrate together. We made sure that each meeting had a named lead, so that we had feedback all the time, that kind of live feedback loop. Again, this is pretty standard inspection stuff, so apologies if I'm teaching granny to suck eggs. It's fairly kind of standard stuff. And made sure that colleagues don't give paperwork to inspectors that we haven't kind of got sight of, so that they're not necessarily giving old information or inaccurate information to inspectors, and any things that went well, that we could make sure that we passed on to colleagues. So a bit of kind of key learning for you from our experience. So as I said earlier, the LANO role is absolutely all consuming, and they need to know the SEND system well, and that health equivalent that I mentioned earlier. Dedicated business support is really essential. So there are hundreds of documents, particularly around the individual children, which I'll come on to in a second under point 3. So the Annex A document set and the framework, then they're unlikely to change. I haven't spotted any change from the pilot inspection to the current framework. It's not quite as many as the ILACs. I'm busy preparing for that at the moment, and I think there's 130 documents for the ILACs inspection, but it's still over 50 for the SEND inspection. And keeping those up to date, having a dedicated librarian, quality assuring those documents, making sure they tell your story that's in your SEP and your strategy is really important. So I'm sure you're busy doing that as we speak. The work on the 6 tracking children is really significant. So the information that they require for each of those 6 children, I think there's 6 bullet points of the information they require from memory. what we put in place was senior leads from social care, SEND, and health providers, who had access to the case management systems in their respective functions and services. But what we also had was a dedicated, quite senior colleague within the local authority, who effectively gathered together all of those hundreds of documents for those children. So all of their assessments, their plans, whether it was in social care, obviously the HCP, but also what we did was quality assure those. And so we had a really gifted colleague who was able to give us a really good pen picture of each of those children. And what you're asked to do is a summary of learning from the partnership of each of those children. So we made sure that we had colleagues with auditing skills that were able to give a really good story from their individual partner perspective on that youngster, but also we had this senior colleague that was able to kind of bring it together into a story and say, we think this is really good practice for this youngster. Here's a bit of learning, something we're not getting quite right, that will be absolutely upfront with the inspectors about, as always, assuring inspectors that you know what good looks like and you've got high standards for practice is all part of the game, isn't it? And so being very upfront and honest about we could have done better around this kiddie is a really important part of that process. So being upfront about that is important. So it's not asked, an overarching view of what we've learned from all 6 children is not asked for in the same way that it has been for other inspection regimes. But I would recommend that you did that. I would recommend that your DCS is able to kind of give a language around what we've learned around looking at those 6 children. This last point, I'm not sure that's made its way into the framework. So one of the things that Ofsted and CQC said to us at the end is they kind of wish they'd put a child on the dynamic support register within the sample of 6. That seems to have kind of moved on a little bit, as my understanding is at the moment. What they have said now, as I'm sure you're aware, is of those 6 children, there'll be one for each of the areas of the code of practice. There'll be a couple of children, 2 children that will be on SEN support, and there'll be one that's in alternative provision. So that's the way that they're sampling. Obviously, they're still trying to get that age balance right, and obviously they're still trying to look at BME and other kind of where they live within your local authority area. To get that kind of sampling bit as right as they possibly can. I think the DSR bit is slightly gone off the equation. However, they have reintroduced that under what they call focused sampling. So there may be a further inquiry into your children on the DSR under what they call focused sampling. For the 6 children, so some will have a very small team around the child. So one of our 6, for example, only had one professional involved. It was an adolescent in college, only had the college involved, no health needs, no safeguarding needs, etc. But one of our youngsters, an 8-year-old girl, she had 22 professionals in and around her family. Through deeper diving, what we picked up that a lot of those professionals were more involved with the siblings because there were some safeguarding concerns. I think the child was on a child protection plan. So we could discount quite a few of those professionals from that team around the child meeting and meeting inspectors, but we still did have, from memory, I think it was 10 or 11 professionals that were involved pretty directly with the care of that young girl. And so the range of professionals per child that you'll need to engage in the inspection, both in terms of any preparatory work you want to do, which I would advise, but also the actual meeting with inspectors, which is online, by the way, it can vary from 1 to X. In terms of gathering the team around the child together for a chat pre-inspection, you're only going to have a window of 3 days, so you don't have a huge amount of time before the inspectors themselves will want to talk to that group of professionals. The 3 surveys, as I said earlier, the parent one didn't go down very well with our parents. They found some of the language quite difficult. The letter was very confusing. So huge thanks to the inspectors for making that much easier, and I think there's a much more they've produced some videos, and there's a much kind of easier access online version of the survey, which is much easier to use. So that's really good. But the survey window was incredibly short. They absolutely weren't necessarily interested in using previous survey information that we've got. They wanted to have a standardized survey, which is completely understandable, because they want to have a kind of standardized survey for parents, for young people and practitioners across the country. So that makes a huge amount of sense from their perspective. I really get it. Obviously, what you found from any SEND surveys you do yourselves will be in your SEF anyway. So uh, what we did ask for, but we didn't get, because it would have been in the final report, would be any kind of reflections on the findings of the survey. So it was a bit of a lost opportunity. So we did ask them to give us a bit of a summary of what our families had told them, because it would help us in terms of improving our service delivery, but they weren't willing to do that. But the findings of the survey would have been reflected in the final report, which, given it was a pilot, we didn't get, as I said earlier. And then I think I made this point, the feedback session is phenomenally dense and a lot of rich material in there. Some of the things that we said back to the inspectors, and I resisted using the term requires improvement when we were giving feedback. It didn't require improvement. It's a good framework, and I thought that they were a really good professional inspection team. We were really pleased with who we got. It was a broadly positive experience for us, but also for our families. And we would have preferred the kind of 4 inspection judgments that we're kind of familiar with, but they were very clear they wanted to stay with the 3. But as I've said earlier, the top outcome would probably never be given, because there's always areas for significant improvement in any complex partnership like SEND. So hence, as I said earlier, the change to the language of the top one in terms of inserting that language around taking action where improvements are needed. The other bit just to be aware of is the engagement of your ICB, your Integrated Care Board. It was a little bit easier for us because I work in the ICB as well. But they will write to the chief executive of your local ICB to say that a SEND inspection is going on. Depending on your ICB, you may not have an executive that's familiar with the children's system or the SEND system. So you'll just need to kind of make sure that your DCS, your chief execs are having those conversations with your ICB now around what an SEND inspection entails. In the actual inspection itself, the expectation of CQC in terms of ICB engagement wasn't particularly major, to be honest with you. But as I said earlier, it's probably a little bit easier for us because I can represent the ICB for Portsmouth. We weren't completely convinced that the inclusion agenda was reflected in the framework. There were some really interesting conversations around sufficiency of special school places, for example. Still kind of felt that they would have expected us to have more special school places, when actually when you look at the data, we've got probably more than many places. And actually we've been driving very hard on the inclusion agenda in mainstream education for a long time. So that didn't seem to kind of come through in the narrative quite as much as we were expecting. I think for point number 6, I think the inspectors really addressed this. I think they've done a lot of work on this in the intervening period, which is brilliant. So just being really clear when they go into a school or a health provider or a nursery, that they're absolutely clear. They're talking about individual children and their sampling methodology, and it's not an inspection of that particular setting. I don't know if they've changed this, but what we did find is that in the timetable, the overarching presentation, your kind of state of the nation, usually given by the DCS on the SEND framework, or the chair of your SEND partnership, whichever you choose, didn't happen until day 11. We felt that was a little bit unhelpful. We're very familiar with other inspection frameworks, particularly ILACs and youth offending, etc., where actually the DCS kind of lays out the self-evaluation, the system, the partnership kind of early on. What it meant was, because it wasn't until day 11, a whole set of hairs got running in those first 10 days that would have closed down quite quickly had we kind of been given the opportunity to give our view, our state of the nation address at the start of the inspection. We did have a session that they asked for, very specifically around the SEF, and that would lead to the key lines of inquiry. That didn't really work quite in that way, if I'm honest with you. I prefer to be really clear from the outset what it is that Ofsted and CQC want to talk to you about for your space and place. They've obviously done a lot of pre-reading and a lot of work on establishing what their key lines of inquiry was. It didn't really feel like there was a clear list that we could kind of work together on between the local area and the inspectorate. So the more you can do to just be really, really clear on what it is that they want to know more about, then the easier it is to manage the inspection. So that was a little bit underwhelming. Ofsted, and they really admitted this. So they assumed they understood the education landscape because they had printed off a list of our 61 schools. But actually, what they didn't get from that list of 61 schools in Portsmouth was which have got inclusion centres, which have got very specialist work on vision and hearing, for example. So they didn't really understand the education landscape in quite the way that they thought they did. So whilst there's an expectation that in Annex A documents you give an outline of your social care provision and you give an outline of your health provision, where your hospital is and who your community provider is, they made an assumption that the education one they knew all about, but they didn't, because they didn't really know what was happening deep in the schools and indeed any specialist nurseries that you may have. What was that next bit? Yeah, something that wasn't in the Annex A documentation that I would recommend you have down the back of the sofa, just in case you need to kind of pull it out, is anything around your panels and your decision-making processes. So where you make decisions on bipartite and tripartite funded packages, it only came out in the kind of heat of the inspection that actually what we hadn't done and they hadn't asked for was a real kind of clear process map for how we make decisions around individual packages of care and support and education for children. So make sure that even though it's not asked for, make sure that you've got something which is really, really clear about how you do joint decision making around particularly high cost and complex cases. Really big focus on the DCO. In fact, one of their recommendations at the end was that the DCO reports on an annual basis formally into the SEND Partnership Board, which I thought was not at all unhelpful and a really good idea. There was less focus on the disco, on the social care version of that in terms of the evidence for EHCPs. That was a little bit odd, and we thought there was surprisingly little focus on the needs of English as an additional language of BME children. That didn't seem to come out of the inspection in terms of inequalities agenda. Seemed to be quite light touch. Right, that's the fastest I've ever done that. That's not bad. Was that helpful, colleagues?
I can ferry the questions to you, Hayden.
Please do.
Yeah, there should be. Are there any questions? Thank you, Hayden. That was really useful. Just, my idea was that to be right at the back. I'll bring the mic home.
I'm from Hamilton Fulham. My question, so they said to you, obviously in the beginning, to mention about PFA and the fact that it's not, there was going to be a potential gap. The bit that I'm genuinely struggling with the framework is the definition of what good looks like. Did they say to you why there was a gap, and then what their expectation of what that gap was, and why it was supposedly not good enough? It doesn't really come out of it.
Did you hear all that, Hayden?
I think I did. Let me try and see if I've answered the question. So, to be really fair to them, they were right in one of the cases. Obviously they build key lines of inquiry from a sample of one sometimes. So they had a really good point to make around how good we were at ceasing EHCPs once youngsters had left college and obviously would have written to the families. So they had a really strong point around that. That was very obvious because that was just literally not abiding by the code of practice in that particular case. So they had a point around that. But I think what your question's hinting at is a really, really good one. And that was part of the kind of challenge that we kind of pushed back is, what does good PFA look like? So we were able to point to a PFA group and a steering group and some work that's taken place. We were able to point to some really good stuff in children's social care and adult social care and some transitioning there. But yeah, I've got huge sympathy with the question because I'm not sure that there is a clear definition of what good PFA work looks like, other than looking at LD health checks after the age of 14 and those kind of bits and bobs. So I think, and I haven't completely absorbed what came out yesterday, but I think the the framework for outcomes. Obviously, there's the PFA outcomes, but how you measure those and how you get a sense of quality around the PFA outcomes, I know is a bit immature in my space and place. Hopefully, you guys are doing it a little bit better, but I suspect it will come back to the PFA outcomes and making sure that you got clarity around what's working well and what's not around those. Does that answer the question?
Thank you.
I think there's just another question coming, Hayden.
No worries.
Can you hear me?
I can.
I'm Bridget Nicola, I'm the designated clinical officer in the London Borough of Southwark. We also took part in pilot, but before the evaluation criteria was there, we were asked to test the methodology. And I'd absolutely validate everything you said there, but I'd go even further in terms of when it actually comes to the inspection, the degree of admin support you need, but I really mean admin support who a good librarian, as you've said, but
Absolutely.
also when there's those place settings visits, and I can only really say about the health perspective of that, the feedback that my colleagues gave was it's really important to have the right people there. So you need somebody who can access your systems, IT wise, and dig out what they're looking at. This is when they're going to the settings visits, but then also somebody of senior enough, you know, as a clinician, the appropriate clinicians that can actually answer the specific questions. We found what we were asked for was 100 cases, which is what we did, and then we aligned those, and then they gave us a short list of 20 about a week later, and then they chose 6 from that, but they actually chose 12 because they needed 6 reserves. And an issue that we had, and I don't know if you found it problematic, was the really short amount of time that you have to engage with those parents and able to get them to the answer the phone and say,
Absolutely.
can you make this? So it's really important that you've got those 6 reserves as well. And they need to be reflective of your demographics within your area.
Yeah, you're spot on. Yeah, the short turnaround time and particularly engaging families. So, for example, one of ours was a Romanian young boy. So mum didn't speak any English at all. So we had a day and a half to find a translator, and all of those kind of nitty gritty, complexy things that get in the way are really important. And yeah, you're spot on. The time you've got to do that is very, very limited. It's very limited.
And the other thing you mentioned, you were fortunate on the health front because you actually work as part of the ICB as well. Just if anyone's in any doubt, it's really, really clear. It's about senior partnership leadership.
Yeah.
So it won't be an option for health not to be there regularly around the table, nor social care. I think that's really clear.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I don't know about your ICB, but in ours, there's the executives of the ICB don't really have a children's background at all. I'm not sure they quite know what SND stands for. So making sure that some of that briefing's taken place. I mean, I thought ICBs are still emerging, aren't they? So I'm probably being a bit rude and a bit unfair. But making sure that your senior children's lead within the ICB is fully aware of the inspection framework is really key.
Hiya, can I just ask about the addition of alternative provision and commission places in alternative provision rather than send places within alternative provision?
Yeah.
How much of an emphasis did the inspectors put on you having an alternative provision strategy in that process, especially around the commissioning of those places?
Amazingly little would be my immediate reaction. I was surprised how little they kind of landed on that. It's relatively straightforward here, to be fair, because we're quite a small city and we've got kind of long-term AP provider, which is actually a combined AP as well as a special school for SEMH. But we do have a quite a complex arrangement in the primary sector. I was surprised how little they really kind of landed on that. We gave them as much information as we possibly could. They did want to talk about, just like they do in the ILACS inspection, they did want to talk about electively home education a little bit. And we've got quite a robust process around reduced timetables, for example. They've now started talking about, as I understand it, sampling, focus sampling on fair access protocol. So I think that will come in as well. But yeah, I was a little bit surprised around the AP bit. It seemed a bit sort of lighter touch than I was expecting.
Hayden Ginns from Lewisham here. Hi, a question around, you mentioned earlier at the end of your presentation that the inspectors paid relatively little attention to children with SEND from English as an additional language background or global majorities. That really worries me, because especially when we are now talking about AP provisions and so on, we know of the disproportionality of exclusions, we know of the unmet needs, unidentified and unmet needs of children ending up in APs. Is there anything we can do from your point of view to prompt this, or is there anything we as a wider group here need to do to bring to the inspector's attention?
Yeah, brilliant question. I couldn't agree more. I was quite surprised at it. Now, I think they would say in their defence that we're only looking at 6 children, and they do try to get a kind of representative sample. Quite how you get a representative sample with 6 children when you got 6,000, 7,000 children with some level of SEND is a tricksy one. I was a little bit surprised by it, because having last year had the youth offending team inspection, where disproportionality was a really strong theme throughout that inspection with the HMIP and indeed the Ofsted inspector, it seemed a little bit light touch for me on this one. So I'd advise your SEF to do that, to really look at and think about disproportionality. I think that'll be really important. So whether you do or don't get asked by the inspectors, I think that's an important theme to really look at. But it seemed a little lighter touch than I was expecting it to be.
There's more.
We've got a few more questions, Hayden, if that's all right.
It's fine.
You can do the rest.
One thing is all people are made service manager of the SEN team from Enfield. I had a couple of questions, but I'm just going to really. The first was in regards to the sampling visits. How do they select the settings that they chose to visit?
Random. So yeah, they would literally say, give us in fact what we were able to do, that's a really good question, because it's all coming back to me now. What we were able to do was say, why don't you go to this school? And it happened to be a school that we love and they love us, and we got some really good work going on. So actually they didn't pick a child or children out of a kind of central system and said, they have to go to that school, therefore we will go to that school. Obviously that is the case for the tracking children, but we were able to say, look, we think there's some really interesting practice and some interesting learning over in this school with a head teacher and a Senko that is deeply impressive, and so we were able to kind of steer that a little bit, to be honest. Obviously your health, you've got a little less kind of flexibility there, because you tend to have kind of quite major health organizations. But yeah, we were able to kind of steer that quite easily. I was quite pleased with that. Now that's not necessarily whether they firmed up a little bit and it's different now and they'll just go through your list of schools and say we want to go to that one. I honestly can't comment on that. That is a possibility.
Thank you. My second question was about case supervision notes. For us, education, health and care, did it include the SEN team, for example?
Yeah, absolutely. So they talked about supervision notes within the context of visiting settings rather than necessarily the central SEND team, or indeed any inclusion, EPs or any other kind of inclusion colleagues you've got in your local authority. But they were very specific. They wanted to talk about supervision when they visited settings. Now, depending on your schools don't always have a language around supervision. Often interpret that as lunchtime supervision, which is a very different thing. But obviously within kind of clinical settings, the CQC were very interested in talking about supervision.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you. I'm Anna Chibber from Achieving for Children of Switchman and Kingston Council. I was just interested to know whether you thought the sampling of the 6 cases actually gave a fair representation of and an outcome, because it seems very, very small, and whether they could really cover that whole huge sentence area.
I couldn't agree more, particularly for an area inspection. I kind of get it in ILACs, where it's a similar methodology. It was the same methodology in the JTI inspection that we had. They started with 6. had a good long chat one evening with the lead inspector around this. I think it was the JTI inspection that we had in 2019, and I think he described it as kind of taking a sample from a ball of cheese to test the whole cheese. Now, I'm not sure that analogy kind of whether that works when you're talking about SEND, because as you rightly point out, A, you're talking about an area, not a local authority or a health provision. And B, you're talking about a huge number of children, and of course 0 to 25 as well. In their defence would be, they start with the 6 children. They will continue to talk in the sampling meetings around, as I said, our experience was 60 to 80 additional children, and that it's all part of a triangulation process will be the language that you'll hear. So there's your SEF, there's your strategy, here's your data, here's your outcomes, here's what your settings are saying, here's some sampling meetings, and here's your detailed on 6 children. So 6 children is part of the story, and it's a major complication within managing the inspection. Part of the trick is if they find something, so you know, in that case that I mentioned earlier in terms of the I think he was 17, I think, that had left college, and we hadn't actually proactively sought to look at whether the HCP needed to continue. That led to a wider conversation around, we found this in this case, is this systemic across the system, and what evidence can you give us that it is or isn't systemic across the system, and you're not getting it slightly wrong for all 17, 18, 19-year-olds. So it's more, I would probably describe it more as a conversation starter than a place where there will be a judgment made. Does that make sense? They're very cute to this, and they're very experienced inspectors, and we thoroughly enjoyed working with them. They were very fair in terms of if you find this in this case, the question back to the local authority area partnership would be, is this systemic? Are you seeing this in other cases? We found it in little Timmy's case. Are we going to find it in another 200 if we keep looking? So it's a conversation starter rather than a place where they would make a final judgment on an area. I think they really get that.
Okay, we've got one more question only. Does anyone have a question?
Yeah, just one more question.
Can you hear me?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you fine.
So I'm Joe Elcast from the London Borough of Redbridge. Question I just wanted to ask, with regard to the evaluation criteria, did they tend to focus on any particular one more than others, or did you think it was an even spread in terms of when they're evaluated?
Oh, that's a very good question. Let me just get them back up so I can remind myself. Yeah, so the first 5 are about children and young people's outcomes, and the second 5 are about leadership and management, essentially. I would say no. The one that we didn't get any kind of verbal feedback from, and as I say, we didn't get a written report, but we didn't get it on number 10, which was leaders create an environment for effective practice and multi-agency working to flourish. But they did give, as I said earlier, really dense feedback around all of those, other than that 10th one, all of the criteria. I think they ran out of energy by the time they got to number 10. But for the first 9, we got some really, really rich, detailed information. So I would treat them as equally valid. I wouldn't choose to well, your self-assessment will tell you whether you need to focus on particular ones, of course, but I would say from an inspectorate perspective, I wouldn't say they necessarily landed on 1 or 2 more than they did the others.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much, Hayden. That's been really, really helpful.
Good.
And obviously we'll get the slides.
Yes,
circulated.
yes, I've also, I just say I've recorded this and I'll send it out.
It's also, so I did want to share this with others in the local authority. Okay, so we're going from virtual to in person now.
Cheers, Vita. Bye-bye.